Good afternoon, everyone. This is now the fourth week of our fall series, 8th Grade Faith. If you grew up Catholic, that probably meant for many of you, you went to Catholic school. And if you didn't go to Catholic school, you went to something called CCD, or religious ed. And as I've been sharing in the series, this is personal for me, I've been sharing that if your experience was anything like my experience, it was not something memorable. In fact, it was boring and at times bad. The typical thing in Catholic church world, at least for my generation and many people who are not my generation, is that your parents bring you to First Communion to the church, then they bring you to confirmation in the church, and then parents feel like you've done your job, you're done, your kids receive the sacraments. And at least for me, and a lot of people like me, that left me in a place where I felt confirmation is being an adult in the Catholic Church. That's what we were taught. And I had no interest in joining that club of other adults in the Catholic Church. It was like punching your time card so often for a lot of people. And so for many people, as soon as you could, you found the exit doors. You found the exit doors. Confirmation around 8th grade was, for all intents and purposes, graduation. Graduation from CCD, graduation from religion class, graduation from faith formation, you name it. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. You're not a bad person, or whoever who is in that situation. It doesn't mean even that you don't believe in God. Perhaps you believe in God, but frankly, it's left you, honestly, with an 8th grade faith. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's great if you're in 8th grade, but like in any other aspect in our life, we're called to mature. We're called to mature. A merely 8th grade faith handicaps us for a useful and life-giving approach to faith. Just think about it. In every aspect of your life, you're seasoned, you're mature, you've grown up, whether it's in your family life or your professional life. Just can you imagine approaching any of those other aspects of your life with an 8th grade maturity? It wouldn't be good. And the same thing is true for our faith. So that's what this series has been all about, moving on and stepping up beyond an 8th grade faith. And I'm trying to do so without any judgment, without any guilt, because that's not what we want to be about. It's the invitation to take that next step, to grow, to move on. Useful approaches to an adult spirituality and faith. So we've talked about moving beyond having an image of God as a kind of divine rule giver in the sky, waiting to give you a citation for your wrongdoing, but instead to see God as our Heavenly Father. And yes, we obey God, we obey His commandments, but not out of fear, but from love. And then 2 weeks ago, we talked about when we were kids, we wanted instant gratification, right? You didn't plan anything beyond the weekend. And as adults, we learned to sacrifice for the long term. In the same way, in our faith, we can think about growing in a relationship with God in light of eternity. That's how God views. And therefore, we, as stewards of the time we have, as stewards of the resources we have, we act and plan in light of eternity. Last week, we talked about moving on beyond having a mentality of religion and faith as an extracurricular activity, something you just do on Sunday morning or in religion class at Catholic school and you check off. But to move on beyond that, to see faith as a lifestyle choice, to be all in faith. And in that context, I invited you to small groups. If you don't know, we have a new ministry here we started this past year of small groups. Over 100 parishioners have tried them out. It's about support, it's about encouragement, it's about accountability in our Christian living, and it's brought an amazing spiritual energy to our parish. If you missed that invitation last week, it's not too late. You can go to the information desk in the back and sign up for small groups, and we're going to reconstitute some new groups later in the month of October. So today, we're moving on and talking about another subject, a very important one. How did you learn how to pray when you were a kid? Think about it. How did you learn how to pray? Did you learn how to pray? So we're pretty much all kids who grew up Catholic. When you were very young, you learned your prayers. You memorized prayers. You probably learned to say a prayer before you have meals, a prayer of family blessing. We were quite pious in my family. We learned to bless ourselves whenever we drove by a Catholic church. That was an old-fashioned thing to do that my father installed into us. My family, we even prayed the rosary on Sunday nights occasionally, especially after the Giants lost on Sunday nights. But let's be honest, as kids, most people kind of pray in monologue to God. It's one direction. So in other words, God, let me pass this test. God, let my team win the game. God, make that girl like me. So those are the kind of prayers, the kind of monologues, going one direction. And again, as I have been in this series, I'll be completely honest with you. When I went beyond 8th grade, I stopped praying. I was still going to church. I was still going through the motions, but I have no memory whatsoever of taking prayer seriously or even knowing what that meant in high school, all through my high school years. So it was in my senior year, actually, in high school, that I started to learn the power of prayer. A young priest came to our parish, and he introduced to our parish in the countryside, our little country parish, something I never heard of. It was called Eucharistic Adoration. And Eucharistic Adoration is a time and a place where Jesus, in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament, is exposed on an altar in a thing called a monstrance. Well, of course, we have our chapel right here. You might know what I'm talking about. I never even knew what that was. I had no idea. And so, in our little parish, the priest set up a little chapel, a makeshift chapel, in a back altar, and he invited people in the parish to sign up for an hour. Amazingly, the chapel almost went 24/7 within months. It was an amazing grace for my little country parish. So many people signed up, including my parents. So suddenly, my parents had a weekly holy hour and Eucharistic adoration. And suddenly, I had to sub for them sometimes because they asked me to. Greg, we can't make it. You're going to go into the church. I was like, what? And suddenly, I experienced for the first time in my life the power of God, being in the presence of Jesus and just being with him. You see, my friends, there's a difference between praying and entering into prayer. So that's what we're going to look at today. In order to look at that, we'll look at the first reading we heard from the prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a prophet in ancient Judea around 650 years before Christ. And he lived in a time where the city of Jerusalem and the king of Judea were corrupt. The king was a tyrant. There was violence. There was corruption all around him. And as a prophet of God, this upset and angered him so much. He looked around and he cried out to God. And I just would invite you to read the prophet Habakkuk. It's a very short book of the Bible. It's only 3 chapters. And we hear the beginning of it at the first reading today. Here's what we heard. Habakkuk cries out, "How long, O Lord? I cry for help, but you do not listen. I cry out to you, violence, but you do not intervene. How long, O Lord?" Have you ever been in that place? I certainly have. You know, here's the first thing we can learn from Habakkuk about prayer. Sometimes we hesitate to bring ourselves completely to prayer. You may have been taught as a kid that it's not appropriate to bring anger to God. Maybe you were taught that don't curse or be angry before God. That's not appropriate. Habakkuk is teaching us otherwise. He's showing us, he's demonstrating to us to bring our whole self in pure honesty and frank honesty before God in prayer. That's the first step of any conversation. If you think about it, any relationship. If you're angry with your spouse, if you're annoyed with one of your siblings or one of your kids, if you're frustrated at work, the first step in better conversation is to be honest, is to be frank right? And if we don't do so, that just may lead to other problems down the road. So it's the same in prayer. It's the same in our relationship with God, beginning with frank honesty. And honestly, some of you may have given up on prayer. Maybe some of you gave up on God entirely for a period in your life because of this point. You cried out like Habakkuk, "How long? How long?" And God didn't solve that problem for you. God didn't stop that accident from happening. God didn't prevent your marriage from falling apart. That can lead many people to give up on prayer, but Habakkuk didn't. Habakkuk didn't. He kept on praying. So in the next verse we hear this: "Why do you let me see ruin? Why? Why must I look at misery? Destruction and violence before me. There is strife and clamorous discord." Why? Why? So he continues to pour out his complaint. Why me, Lord? Why do bad people seem to prosper? Why do good people who've done nothing wrong seem to suffer all the time? Isn't this one of the biggest questions of life? Why does a good, all-powerful God seem to allow evil and injustice in the world? Well, that's led people to give up on God, to just give up on believing in God. But nowhere in the Bible or in Christian teaching does it say God must be perfect because otherwise he wouldn't allow this stuff. That's not true. God allows suffering. So Habakkuk continues to lean into God. You see, if you have ever been in a place like this, crying out, it could be an opportunity to go deeper. You could be a world-class prayer instead of complaining. Well, Habakkuk eventually gets an answer from God. You can read about it in chapter 1 in the following verses of this verse. It's basically bad news, honestly. And this is like shocking. So God says, "Habakkuk, I hear your prayer about the injustice of the king and about all the corruption and violence of the city, the people around you. So I'm going to send the Babylonians." That was bad news. Here's what you need to know about the Babylonians. They were this great empire that would later come to destroy the city of Jerusalem and the whole kingdom. Here's a contemporary equivalent to Habakkuk's prayer. Say you were praying to God, "God, why are there so many corrupt politicians in Washington, D.C.? This is just hypothetical because nobody would ever pray like this. "God, why do you allow so much corruption among our politicians in Harrisburg or in Washington?" And then God answers your prayer. He says, "Don't worry about that because I'm going to send the Russians and the Chinese and they're going to take over the government. Don't worry." That was essentially God's answer to Habakkuk's prayer. Habakkuk is dumbfounded. He's shocked. He's just left in silence. You know, if God is all-powerful, of course, we believe that his ways wouldn't always be our ways. But how would you respond in that situation? That is a test of endurance and perseverance. So here's Habakkuk's response. He says, "I will stand at my guard post and station myself upon the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what answer he will give to my complaint." So Habakkuk, even though the news is bad, he stands at his post. He says, "I will stand at the rampart. I will keep watch. I will keep guard. I will strategically place myself so that I can hear God speak to me. If he will speak to me, when he will speak to me, I'm going to stand my post." Oh, here's the second thing about prayer that Habakkuk can teach us. Don't give up. Place yourself every day in a disciplined way, in a strategic way, to not just talk to him, but to listen to him. That is the conversation that God wants us to have. So if you don't already have a daily prayer time, I just challenge you to have that daily prayer time. It makes all the difference. Even if that has been something you gave up on in the past. And also, because our world is so full of noise, as soon as you walk out the door, we have to be strategic to turn off that noise, at least for 5 minutes a day, to have quiet time. Not just saying our prayers again, but allowing, standing firm at your guard to let God speak to you. So with that in mind, a couple invitations and opportunities for prayer. The first is next Sunday, we're having a holy hour here for all families. It's something we did last year, and we're doing it again this year for the whole parish. A time for adoration, benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, praise and adoration, and time just to spend with Jesus and his power. Let him speak to you. That's one opportunity next Sunday at 12:15. And another opportunity is to sign up here for Eucharistic adoration. You know that we have a chapel over here dedicated to St. Joseph. We have adoration from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., Monday through Friday. We intend to expand those hours. We want to expand first on Tuesday afternoons and evenings. So perhaps God is calling you to commit to a holy hour and come to the church once a week for that hour. That could bring your prayer life to a whole new level, not just praying to God, but truly entering into prayer. And about adoration, I want to share with you a very powerful testimony from a parishioner. And she gave us permission to share this testimony. So she says, coming from adoration the other day, I received a call from my sister. Hey, what are you up to? She asked. I said, I just came out of the chapel and had a great hour of prayer. And she responded, who even are you right now? To which we both started laughing. You see, a year ago, this would have sounded crazy to me as well. 2021 was a rough year for so many reasons. For me, I was struggling with my family life, my marriage especially, and I found myself longing for a change. I felt like I was drifting through the days, waiting for them to end, which prevented me from really being present for my family and friends. In the fall of 2021, Father Greg, that's me, invited the congregation to attend adoration, and for the first time in my life, I felt a strong desire to be closer to Jesus. Like maybe that's what I was missing. I honestly didn't even know what I was supposed to do. I just knew I wanted to do it. It's been almost a year since I started attending Eucharistic adoration. I try to visit once a week. My relationship with Jesus, my family, and myself has improved tremendously since then. In fact, when I miss a week, I feel like I take steps backwards and that things even seem more difficult. It's a wake-up call that in order to make a real connection, it takes dedication, commitment, consistency, and true intention. I have such a long way to go, and there are still days when I feel like I don't even know how to pray or question if I'm living my life in the right way. But once I come to the chapel, I feel confident that all Jesus wants right now is for me to be present in his presence, and that everything else will be fine. Well, thank you for that person, for that beautiful testimony. You know, God ultimately does respond to Habakkuk. Habakkuk learns from God as he stands at the watchpost waiting for God's response. In chapter 2 of Habakkuk, we hear this. God says, the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and will not disappoint. If it delays, wait for it. Wait for it. It will surely come. It will not be late. God's time is not our time. God will fulfill his vision. His vision for his people is one of blessing. It's one of blessing. So don't give up in prayer. Stand your guard. God will respond. He will guide us in his appointed time, which will not fail. Well, my friends, Habakkuk learned the lesson. What is prayer? Prayer is not just talking to God and expecting that you're going to get the response you want. Prayer is about conversing and especially listening to God and learning the response that he desires. So my friends, that's what's prayer. We can learn, like Habakkuk, to not expect that God will answer everything we want, but instead we can learn in prayer to desire what we hear. Amen.